Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really cutting through the noise to explore something quite rare in global affairs, a genuinely rational dialogue about, well, the future of global politics.
That's right.
We're diving into the analysis shared during that recent conversation between the renowned Chinese scholar Zhang Weiwei and the Maokun Forum organizer Griffiths.
And this is, I think, critical source material for you listening, because this kind of cross-cultural dialogue, East and West, it's absolutely crucial right now.
But it seems so difficult.
It is, yeah. It's constantly hampered by, ideological prejudice. Many in the West really struggle, frankly, to accept a non-Western power rising so quickly.
Especially one that doesn't fit the usual mold.
Exactly. One that doesn't conform to the established Western democratic blueprint. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to extract what Western thinkers, when they manage to set aside that baggage, are actually trying to learn about the quote-unquote China model.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. So let's unpack this. We should probably start with the core concept that really frames the whole discussion, the civilizational state.
Right.
Griffiths asked Zhang Weiwei, what is this and what does its rise mean for the modern state system, which, let's face it, for centuries has been defined by Western nation-state standards.
Yeah, and the term civilizational state, it's offered up as more of a factual description, not just a theory.
Okay.
It basically identifies a state where you have an uninterrupted ancient civilization, and Chinese civilization is the key example here. It's really the only major ancient one still fully existing, overlapping entirely with a modern, super-large political state.
Mm-hmm.
The defining thing is this ability to be both ancient and thoroughly modern simultaneously.
From a Western viewpoint, though, ancient and modern often feel like opposites, like one replaces the other. How does the dialogue actually justify coupling them like that? It sounds a bit like a contradiction.
Yeah, it can seem that way. But there's some pretty tangible examples.
Yeah.
Take the Chinese language, Hansi. Its roots go back, what, 3,000–4,000 years?
Right, ancient.
Ancient.
Yeah.
Yet the sources point out that the way you input Hanzi on a smartphone or computer today, it's often faster, more efficient than typing in English.
Really? Faster?
Yeah. So the ancient root actually supports a highly modern, efficient outcome.
That is a powerful point. Okay, so that's language. What about governance? Does that huge historical continuity tell us something about the ruling body's structure or competence?
It implies, well, a degree of continuity that's pretty much unique historically. Since China unified back in 221 BC, the sources note it's largely been governed by a unified ruling group.
For most of that time.
For most of that time, yeah.
Yeah.
This depth suggests they've sort of avoided the kind of internal fragmentation you see in younger states. And if you look at the current political system, it's described as integrating traditional Chinese selection. Based on the old imperial exams, the Kiju.
The meritocratic system.
Right, that selected bureaucrats for ages, integrating that with certain Western election practices.
So it's like a blend, merit selection on top of a unified culture.
Kind of, yeah. The source material really emphasizes the backgrounds of the top leaders. They often have huge experience, like successfully managing populations of over 10 million people before they even get to the highest national level.
Wow.
Which suggests, a pretty high level of proven governing competence built partly on these historical methods.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for global influence. Zhang Weiwei's view, as presented, is that China is actively redefining modernity. The dialogue kind of frames Western multi-party systems as being partial interest parties, always competing, which leads to society breaking apart and makes long-term planning really hard.
That's the core critique, structurally speaking.
Yep.
Because Western systems are so driven by votes, and frankly by money,
right.
Political groups often end up just representing very specific or partial interests, and that makes genuine, unified, long-term strategy almost impossible.
Like building high-speed rail across the U.S., for example.
Exactly. The Chinese political structure, in contrast, is positioned as representing the overall long-term interests of the people, which allows them to do these massive decades-long projects, like the poverty alleviation we should definitely talk about later.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, speaking of internal struggles, let's pivot to the challenges Griffiths brought up about the West. Specifically, the fragmentation we see in U.S. democracy, the intense political division.
Yeah, that came up immediately. The discussion focused on that structural instability, using the January 6th Capitol riot as a real flashpoint. It generated huge international skepticism.
Yeah.
The source material actually highlighted two really pointed quotes that went viral globally.
Oh, what were they?
Well, first there was that viral Chinese social media joke, something like, if the U.S. saw what the U.S. is doing today, the U.S. would invade the U.S.
To liberate itself from U.S. tyranny. Yeah, I remember that one. Dark humor, but it hits a nerve.
It does. And the other was from a Brazilian diplomat who tweeted, highlighting the irony, this is the first coup on the American continent without a U.S. embassy involved.
Oof. Yeah, that speaks volumes about global perceptions.
It really reflects that surprise and, frankly, skepticism about the stability of U.S. democracy. And the dialogue didn't stop there. It cited a Harvard professor's analysis arguing that the refusal to accept election results makes U.S. democracy look more and more like what they termed a third world democracy.
That's a really sharp critique embedded in the dialogue. But what about the classic defense, the separation of powers? How did they address that?
A strong counter was presented. The idea is that the formal separation, legislative, executive, judicial, it's often overshadowed by what the dialogue calls the power of capital.
The power of capital.
Yeah. This force is cited as the key structural problem, sitting sort of above and controlling the other three branches, pushing agendas that benefit special interests, not the collective good.
So the argument is financial power just overrides the checks and balances.
Okay, but I have to ask, for balance, did the dialogue address the flip side? Like accountability or human rights redress in a system that's so unified it doesn't have those competing interests pushing back immediately?
Well, that tension wasn't totally ignored, but the discussion shifted pretty quickly into the cultural context, suggesting China's own tradition provides a kind of internal counterbalance, which brings us neatly to identity politics.
Yes, a huge issue fragmenting the West right now.
Definitely. And the dialogue draws a stark contrast here. It states that Western culture tends to emphasize individual rights and differences almost above all else.
Which leads naturally to identity groups forming and competing.
Right, whereas Chinese culture emphasizes he or butong.
Harmony without uniformity.
Exactly. The cultural goal is to find common ground, maintain cohesion, while still acknowledging differences exist and respecting them.
Is there a deeper root for that, like philosophical or even linguistic? Oh, absolutely. Philosophically, you have the three teachings: Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Ru, Tao, Fo. They've coexisted for centuries without the kind of missionary zeal or religious wars that marked European history. And linguistically, the source gave a great example. In English, river, lake, ocean, totally different root words.
Right.
In Chinese, the characters for all three share the same radical, the symbol for water. It visually emphasizes the common element, water, even while showing the different forms.
That's fascinating, a visual representation of finding commonality. So this cultural inheritance, it shapes governance by balancing rights with what? Responsibility.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The culture emphasizes duties and responsibilities alongside rights. And that, the argument goes, helps the system avoid getting bogged down by the overemphasis on difference that fuels Western identity politics.
Okay, this seems to feed directly into the next challenge, populism, which often gets inflamed by those extreme identities and short-term thinking. Does the dialogue say populism is just a Western thing?
No. It acknowledges populism is global. It exists in China, too. But the argument is the Chinese system is structurally better equipped to handle it.
How so?
Well, Western politics are described as ballot-driven. Politicians constantly have to pander to immediate public feeling, right? And that's made worse by money, social media, AI.
Yeah, the feedback loop is incredibly fast and often emotional.
Exactly. So if the Western incentive is short-term pandering, what's the Chinese mechanism to, as they put it, transcend populism?
Right.
It comes down to the decision-making process, democratic centralism, often summed up as from the masses to the masses.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means there's this structured approach. You gather input widely from the public first. That's the from the masses part. Then that input is synthesized, analyzed, tested against the overall long-term interests of the people before being centrally implemented. That's the to the masses part. This sort of procedural filter allows the system to make decisions that might not be popular right now but are seen as beneficial down the road.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift to global tensions. The Thucydides trapped the idea that conflict is almost inevitable between a rising power and an established one. How did the dialogue frame China's perspective on avoiding war?
Well, the view presented is that the civilizational state is historically cautious about using force. The strategic preference comes straight from Sun Tzu. The best victory is winning without fighting.
So development over conflict.
That's the emphasis. They quote former U.S. President Jimmy Carter telling Donald Trump something striking.
Oh, yeah.
Carter apparently pointed out that China focuses on development, while the U.S., in contrast, had fought wars in 16 of the previous 24 years.
16 wars in 24 years, compared to China.
Compared to China, which hasn't fired an external shot, the dialogue notes, in over 40 years. Yet China is often painted as the aggressor.
Wow, 16 and 24 versus 0 and 40. That is a staggering statistic defined in this dialogue. Does it explain why? Is it institutional?
The analysis ties it directly back to priorities. And the proposal offered is, instead of mutually assured destruction, the old Cold War idea.
Right.
They propose MAP, mutually assured prosperity.
MAP, okay.
And to really hammer this home, the dialogue presents this incredibly stark economic contrast, spending priorities.
Okay, let's hear the numbers.
Over a decade, the U.S. spent, reportedly, $2.26 trillion on the war in Afghanistan.
Trillion. Okay.
During that same rough period, China spent the equivalent of about $200 billion.
Billion with a B.
Billion, yeah, to lift nearly 100 million people out of extreme poverty.
So the U.S. war cost was nearly 10 times what China spent to lift 100 million people from poverty.
Pretty much, yeah. That forces a real recalibration, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The implication laid out is profound. If that $2.26 trillion had been used following the China model of focused poverty alleviation, it theoretically could have wiped out global extreme poverty entirely.
That's the implication drawn.
Yeah.
And the problem, according to these sources, is seen as institutional. The U.S. military-industrial complex. It just drives military expansion and conflict. It was even cited as the biggest driver behind the Ukraine conflict, even before it fully escalated.
Right. This brings us back to history again. Western countries often see today's world through their own past, like Germany challenging Britain before World War I. How does China's much longer history shape its current behavior, especially this non-conflict stance?
It loops back to culture again. China's history, as we touched on with the three teachings, emphasizes inclusion, tolerance. There's no real historical blueprint for missionary zeal or forcing ideology on others. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, visited China after World War I. He observed that China's culture seemed genuinely peaceful, whereas the West's was just war, war, war.
Wow, Russell said that.
He did. And he predicted that once China became strong enough to defend itself, its peaceful culture would actually be a great asset to humanity.
That non-missionary tradition seems really key to understanding their strategic thinking. Okay, let's tackle a practical question. We got one from a listener, a teacher actually, about internal polarization.
Ah, yes.
How does the dialogue suggest governments should handle it when two sides within a country become extreme opposites, especially online these days?
That's where they make a distinction between different types of conflict or contradictions.
Okay.
They identify external or enemy contradictions, things coming from, say, foreign hostile forces, cyber armies, and then internal or people's contradictions, basically, the everyday disagreements within society.
And the strategy for those internal ones, the everyday stuff that gets heated.
Rational communication, using facts, avoiding inflammatory rhetoric, and trying to gradually mature the dialogue process itself.
Easier said than done online.
Absolutely. But key tools mentioned include avoiding logical fallacies, things like double standards or slippery slope arguments.
Like saying regulating big tech means we're going back to a planned economy.
Exactly, that kind of illogical jump. Arguing that regulating capital means a complete return to pre-reform policies. It's about sticking to the facts of the specific issue.
And what about individual responsibility in all this? Especially with online anonymity.
This relies heavily on personal ethics, which need to be emphasized more when you can be anonymous. The dialogue actually brings up a Confucian concept. Junzi shen kiduja.
Okay, what does that mean?
Roughly. A gentleman is cautious when he is alone or unseen.
Ah, so even when no one's watching, like online, you maintain your ethical standards.
Precisely. Cultivating that high individual standard is seen as vital to prevent online spaces from just degrading into shouting matches.
Okay, let's wrap up the systematic analysis part by revisiting the classification of states. We've talked nation state, civilizational state. What's the bigger picture? How does the dialogue classify states globally?
Well, the analysis suggested three main historical categories.
Yeah.
First, you've got your classic nation states, roughly one nation, one state, Japan. Most Western European countries fit here.
Right.
Second, non-nation or tribal states. These are places where loyalty is primarily to the tribe or ethnic group, not really the central state entity itself. Think parts of Africa or the Middle East, historically. And third, the civilizational state, which is China, defined by that uninterrupted, integrated, ancient civilization within a modern state. It also encompasses the idea of the Chinese nation, of course.
But the world's more complex than just 3 boxes. Did the sources offer more nuance, subcategories?
Yes, definitely. To capture more complexity, they suggested a few subtypes. One is secondary nation states. Think Korea, Vietnam, Thailand.
How are they different?
They're nation states, but they're historically connected to and deeply influenced by the broader East Asian civilizational sphere, centered on China historically.
Got it. What else?
Then you have religious states, or maybe aspirations towards them, like ideas in the Middle East about potentially restoring a historical caliphate structure where religion is the primary organizing principle above the nation.
Okay, and there was one more intriguing one.
Right, the company states.
Tell us more about company states. That sounds like a really different starting point for a government.
It really is.
Yeah.
These are countries where the modern governance structures didn't grow organically from, say, a kingdom or a local political evolution. Instead, they originated from the administrative structures left behind by failed colonial trading companies.
Like the East India Company.
Exactly like that. This legacy, where the state was essentially founded to facilitate resource extraction and trade for a foreign company, can still be seen, the argument goes, in many former colonies across Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, Latin America.
And what's the consequence of that legacy?
Well, the consequence is their institutional DNA might still be geared towards resource extraction or serving external commercial interests, rather than, say, national development or accountability to their own population. It can lead to big problems with regulatory capture and building strong, independent national institutions.
This whole conversation really underscores how vital it is to keep these rational communication channels open between powers. And also, maybe, the need for cultural self-confidence to face competition without just falling back into old historical fears or patterns.
Absolutely. And if you connect this back to the bigger historical picture, European states, interestingly, face a dynamic a bit like China's warring states period centuries ago. There was this inherent pressure towards centralization, towards unity.
But Europe never unified like China did. Why not?
Well, several unique European factors got in the way.
Yeah.
There was the geographic reality of the UK acting as an offshore balancer, always preventing continental dominance.
Right.
Then the sheer destructiveness of modern European warfare made unification incredibly costly. And crucially, the early rise of merchant capital-fueled parliamentary systems, which tended to be more fragmented, representing competing commercial interests, rather than leading to a single, cohesive state form like China achieved.
So, okay, if we pull all these threads together, the long-term planning, the need for cohesion, how resources are allocated, what's the big question this dialogue leaves us grappling with?
Well, we're seeing identity politics, deep fragmentation, the huge influence of capital in the West, all suggesting potentially a struggle to maintain the kind of unity needed for really effective modern state function, especially in a competitive world. So if intensified global competition does demand internal cohesion and that kind of decades-long strategic planning we discussed, the provocative thought is, what might current Western state models need to sacrifice? Or perhaps, what could they integrate from alternative models like the civilizational state approach to achieve a comparable level of sustained unity and strategic capacity?
That is definitely something to mull over. A challenging question for the future.